is Dr. Dibyesh Anand. He's the head of, you all know him. He actually needs no introduction. He's the organizer, co-organizer of this series. He's the head of department and reader in international relations in the Department of Politics and IR here at the University of Westminster. His research areas include majority-minority relations in China and India, Tibet issues, and China-India relations. He's the author of Geopolitical Exotica, Tibet in the Western Imagination, and Tibet, a Victim of Geopolitics, Hindu Nationalism in India and the Politics of Fear, and of several articles and papers on security, identity, and Asian politics. He's currently working on a project on China-India border disputes and on colonial practices of the post-colonial states of Asia.
Thank you. Oh, I don't want to throw this out. Thanks a lot, Natasha. In fact, I'll try my best to be even less than 15 minutes so that we have 15, 20 minutes left for question answer. I mean, as we have seen, most of you have covered what I wanted to cover in a certain sense. I mean, what we see is usually Kashmir is looked at in terms of certain fetishization of borders, territories, and states. That's how it would be seen. And therefore, we had a context where it would be seen as a dispute between India and Pakistan, at most dispute between India, Pakistan, and China, where some may pay lip service to Kashmir as third party, but not as the most important party. And that's how it would often be framed. So when in 1990s, and I was a master's student then, and I was trying to read on Kashmir, all the writings were about simple India, Pakistan, and competing versions of nationalism, and somehow all three are equally important. Now, for practical purpose, they are important, but there's certain kind of fetishization that we need to challenge. The fetishization is where we assume that the existing states have a priori privilege over what narratives to tell. And that's something that we need to challenge, because this kind of fetishization is not only of state but also of geopolitics. And as my own, some of you may know, my interest started, I mean, I came to Kashmir via Tibet. And that's how I see myself, that not in terms of traveling, but intellectual traveling. My initial work was largely on Tibet, and it remains my main area of research. Colonization in a post-colonial setup, the idea of liberating the other. So Chinese claim that they have liberated Tibetans, the way Indians claim that they have got sort of liberated Kashmiris. So in that sense, we see a lot of commonalities, and of course there are differences too, I'm not denying it. But there's certain kind of geopolitics, statehood, and border making taking place in the region, China, India, Pakistan specifically, where people don't matter, territories matter. And that's something I would like to challenge. Because state, and when you look at Kashmir, reporting about Kashmir, for instance, in Indian newspapers or even in Western newspapers, often it's about security, law and order, strategy, conflict, sovereignty. So all these are language of power, not language of the people. And that's why I would like to try to express my disquiet with. Now, before I go on, I mean, often, even when we talk of, let's say, Azadi for Kashmiris, or self-determination for Kashmiris, or even something basic, giving equal human rights to Kashmiris, that Indian constitution provides. Even in that, often the retort usually we get is there too. What about Kashmiri Pandits? Now, most people who say, what about Kashmiri Pandits, have never cared about Kashmiri Pandits. So when Pandits had the exodus in early 90s, then they didn't care. But Kashmiri Pandit issue becomes a favorite issue to communalize it, to Hinduize it, and then always beat up Kashmiri Muslims by saying, what about Kashmiri Pandits? And I've not come across any single credible work that says, what about Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims? I mean, I'm talking of those who only say, what about Kashmiri Pandits? So it's almost an excuse there. But the second argument I have often come across is, but is Pakistan any better? Why don't you talk of minority rights in Pakistan and Bangladesh? I said, why not even Burma or Sri Lanka or Bhutan, Nepal? I mean, but the argument is always Bangladesh and Pakistan. Now, the fact is, of course, I mean, minority rights or situation of minorities in Pakistan or Bangladesh, let's say Pakistan in this context, is nothing to shout, there's nothing to be proud about. It is atrocious. But does that imply us being selectively silent about India because supposedly, according to them, India is a better democracy? I have no evidence, but that's what they claim. Or is the ethical position that, yes, we should challenge Pakistan or Bangladesh or Burma or whatever, but we should also challenge India? So often those who say, what about Pakistan, are those who would never challenge India. which is, I mean, we live in that bizarre setup. I mean, now, what I would like to argue, talk about is, we need to move beyond that border, state, India, Pakistan, or for that matter even Kashmir, to talk about even Kashmiris and to some extent Indians, Pakistanis and others. We need to talk of the people, because when we talk of Indian rule in Kashmir, and I'm focusing largely on India here, and we can discuss about Pakistan if you want during question answer, but India here, we have to look at how Kashmiri bodies and the bodies keep coming back. The disappeared bodies, the tortured bodies. So what kind of Kashmiri bodies exist? Of course, there's a living body, no doubt, but they are killed bodies, murdered bodies, mutilated bodies, disappeared bodies. And Parveena ji's own work, and others, as she pointed out, and there's no need for me to say that, how disappeared bodies, what kind of thing does it do to us? I mean, I just keep imagining, and that's why I was being very emotional. I was being emotional when she was speaking. I was imagining myself disappearing. I'm not a parent, so I would not understand how. I was myself disappearing, and what my mother or father would feel like, and not only disappearing, but forever disappearing in certain sense, but not have even the certainty of knowing whether I'm killed or not. I mean, that's the worst kind of humiliation and torture that a state can do. And I was speaking to Parveena ji earlier. I said, and I would ask, and it's not being naive, but what do these people say? So when she goes to the military men or the court, what do they say? They say nothing. I mean, how much more arrogant can a state become where first they disappear someone, then they don't inform, then they don't have the courtesy of even apologizing for it. So that question of apology doesn't exist. And when you raise it, they'll say, the point is, so many people exist. So who knows? So that kind of arrogance. Now, Kashmiris have therefore bodies have been suffering through murdered, disappeared, tortured, half-widowed, raped, blinded, and in a sense, I mean, my closer interaction with Kashmir politically started last year after the brutal hanging of Afzal Guru, but also because of my interest in what was happening to kids who were being blinded by pellet injury. So that's how it started. I mean, at least closer interaction started with that. So blinded. And now imagine, it's not simply someone is blinded. Someone is 90% blind in one eye, second eye is okay so far. But facility doesn't exist, and as Mirza Wahid was pointing out, or someone was that, look, people are very anxious at taking the kids to the hospital in case the police will say who's here injured, which implies that they were somehow involved in stone pelting or something, and impose and put a case on them. Now, this particular kid, I was trying to sort of, I was interested in a certain sense. He lost one eyesight, 90%. The second eye was fine. But all the very senior doctors in Delhi and Aligarh were telling me that he needs to be treated properly because there's sympathetic blindness that happens. He needs to be treated. We tried, I mean, in the end it didn't work out, but we tried our level best. I tried to find out what was happening. The question was, there was main anxiety, and I can understand why, of the family was, there was a case against the boy. The boy was only 12 years old. The case was that he had been involved in throwing stones. Now, interestingly, that case had been put very lightly. But once, let's say, we got involved, the local police, they increased the case, the severity of case. So then the dilemma was, do we struggle for justice for the kid or try to get him sorted out and remove the case? So those kind of dilemmas, I'm sure if someone like me who's an outsider, I'm not Kashmiri, I'm completely an outsider, if that kind of moral dilemma comes to me, whether to help a person or work for the collective, what to do, then one can imagine the kind of torturous existence many Kashmiris have to lead every day of life, and Fauzia's images and others' images also showed some of that, right? There have been mutilated bodies all around Kashmir and humiliated ones. So even those who are physically fit and there's no direct torture to them, there is a sense of humiliation all the time, right? So they're not free, and that is the idea. Now, whether Samsung or iPhone or whatever they get, it doesn't change the fact that there's a certain indignity to being seen as someone who is occupied. And this is something we have to remember again and again, that Kashmiri bodies are the occupied bodies. And I don't need to explain why we call it occupied, because we have seen enough evidence of it. If this is not occupation, I don't know what would be occupation. But one ploy with which Indian state and Indian nationalists play is, first they'll say, oh, Kashmiris are Indians, right? So fine, you're Indian, why not? So that's the argument that that would be used. And then when you go to Kashmir and you speak to CRPF or paramilitaries or military men, they'll say, and I'm using it in crude language, ye sab sale chor hain. All these are thieves, or all these are traitors. These are Muslims. They'll always be traitors. And these are, this is a statement I'm giving off from the paramilitaries who control the state, right? Who are the visible face of the control. Now, so at one level, Kashmiris are Indians. Yet, they'll not be treated as Indians. It's like very weird kind of, what Mirza Wahid was pointing out and others pointing out, very weird kind of integral part that's integral but also alienated forever. And they'll never be fully seen as Indian. But the second ploy, which is more recent, I have a feeling, is that, oh, but you see, Kashmir has so many people. There are Ladakhis, there are Jammuites, then there are Paharis, and then the Gujars, and then the Kashmiri Muslims, and the Pandits, and the Sikhs, then the Shias, and the Sunnis. Yes, that's ethnographically correct. But if someone says there are different voices in Kashmir, and we are talking of the Indian occupied right now, of course, if you include Pakistan occupied, that's even more complex. Recognizing the diversity of voices is different from using the diversity in order to then say, therefore, there is no Kashmiri voice, and therefore Kashmiris do not deserve any right to self-determination. The fact that many Jammu Hindus may like India, or Ladakhis may prefer India, or Baltis may prefer, I don't know, maybe Tibet if Tibet becomes independent, right? That is secondary for me. But the way Indian nationalists would use these differences is always to break up Kashmir, a Kashmiri discourse into so many fragments that the only option therefore is, look, India is a benign power that's trying to balance between Hindus and Muslims and Shias and Sunnis and everyone else, which is a very classic case of divide and rule of colonialism. So in that context, I mean, this is how I see Kashmir in general. So what does it say to me about India or Indians? I mean, what it says about India is that India is an occupying power. It is a colonial power. It may claim to be post-colonial, but it is very much colonial. So kind of post-colonial analysis we do about British Empire and French Empire and the everyday humiliation that involved of the colonized, we need to do about Indian rule in Kashmir. So in a certain sense, we have to bring back the lens which we use to critique empire and colonialism in order to critique and question Indian rule in Kashmir. What does it say to us about Indian nationalism? Let's not even go there. What kind of nationalism allows one to see someone like Parveena Ahangarji, see in Delhi, but say, well, what can we do? I mean, so there's something cruel and very dehumanizing about that kind of nationalism that exists in India. The fact that, of course, it happens to many in India, not only to Kashmiris, but the Nagas and the Mizos, or to Dalits, that doesn't change the fact that it happens to Kashmiris, right? So in a certain sense, and I'll conclude with that, is we need to look, when we try to critique or question or even analyze Indian occupation of Kashmir, we have to take into account nature of state, nature of nation, and nature of geopolitics, because India is not an exceptional state. It is very much a normal state. What India does in Kashmir is what Pakistan does in Balochistan, what China does in Xinjiang or Tibet, and many others. So what I'm saying is, it's a certain kind of normalization, and we need to critique that normalization in academia. We have to challenge that. So in the end, and I'll conclude with that, what we require is an azadi. Azadi means freedom, of course, most of you know, and azadi not only of Kashmir and Kashmiris from India and Pakistan, but also azadi of others from the kind of nation state that exists in India, Pakistan, China, especially in that region. Now, when I say we need azadi for all peoples, including Indians themselves, I don't mean to trivialize the struggle for azadi of Kashmiris. So it's not that we need azadi of Indians first, then only we work for azadi of Kashmiris. No, all these struggles have to go on together. And therefore, at that, I guess it's a positive end. Let's hope for an azadi that's just, azadi that no longer disappears people, azadi that treats human beings more importantly than state. Thank you.